All right. Well, brethren, thank you very much for giving me the time. The passage I'd like to begin with in sharing my testimony is one in which the Apostle Paul was in many ways sharing his own testimony, and that's Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 11. It says there, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." And then he goes into his background. "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." And then I love the way he puts it in verse 15 and 16. "But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." Clearly, the Apostle Paul was overwhelmed by the reality that what he was going through was not because of him. It wasn't an accident in history. It was a fulfillment of what God himself had foreordained before time began. Well, I feel the same way too as I share with you both my testimony and also the way in which I found myself in ministry at Kabwata Baptist Church. I was brought up in a church-going family. My great-grandfather was actually a missionary and participated in the establishment of a mission station in a denomination that grew out of David Livingstone's missionary activities. So that's where the background is. But however, growing up, going to church, that denomination, and more specifically the congregation that we're going to, they had lost the gospel by and large. So it was moral teaching that was the primary diet. My mom died when I was 9 years old, and consequently, in our African custom, her immediate elder sister then took my two sisters and myself to bring us up through our teenage years. The first one to come back to my dad's home was my elder sister, and then a year later I followed. And it was at that point that the crisis that brought about my salvation took place. When I left Dad's home soon after my mom died, Dad was not taken to alcohol. By the time I came back, he was an alcoholic. And I suppose you can understand, he lost his wife and he lost his children. So from family zero, suddenly. And he may have taken to alcohol because of that. And then, because of that, he was basically selling anything that he could in order to sustain his drinking habits. So I came back to a home that was a shadow of its former self. Anything that could be sold had been sold. And Dad would be coming back in the middle of the night, dead drunk. You could hear him coming, walking, singing some drunken song. So it was terrible to me. However, my elder sister had just become converted. And so when she left the home we were in, coming back to Dad's home, she was not converted. Then she got converted in a local Baptist church. So by the time I was coming, I found, first of all, a very depressing situation in the house, and then a very joyful sister. And that I found very difficult to reconcile. I was depressed by what I found. But there she was singing Amazing Grace with joy. And I realized there's something this girl has that I obviously don't have. And also a friend of mine who had just become converted to Christ sent me an evangelistic letter. It was not the first time I came across the gospel, but definitely that was the message that went right past my defense mechanisms and got to my heart. The previous time I listened to the gospel, the person who was sharing with me the gospel, his own life was not much different from mine. So I remember thinking to myself, he just wants me to change churches. That's the way I interpreted his evangelism. But this letter now was different. Although I hadn't seen this friend in terms of his changed life, but he explained to me because we were soon to meet. And he was saying, I want you to know what has happened to me. And he pointed me to the cross of Christ, repentance and faith, and so on and so forth. For about 3 months, I tried to be what my sister was, bearing in mind the information that I had received through the letter from my friend. And I completely failed. So by March 1979, I realized I have missed the turn somewhere. So I went back home and reread the letter, and it was pointing me to Christ, that I should pray to him for the forgiveness of sins. Being brought up in a context where we were sort of repeating prayers, I then ransacked my sister's bedroom looking for something that would have a prayer on it. I finally found a tract called Here's Happiness, and at the back there was a prayer. So I knelt by my bedside, prayed through it once, prayed through it a second time. I threw the whole thing away and then just cried to the Lord to save me. So that's how my own conversion took place. And I remember opening my Bible. I had just bought a Bible the day before because I really wanted to settle this matter once and for all. So I opened it and I went to the book of Ecclesiastes. I think I just opened it in the middle. And as I was reading this book, I could not believe how sweet and meaningful it was. I was thinking to myself, maybe it was just that particular book in the Bible that I hadn't come across up to that point. Well, the Lord had opened my spiritual eyes now. I could now understand the scriptures. So that's how I came to Christ. And having come back to my dad's home, I came because my dad's home was fairly close to the main university that we had in Zambia, and I had just been accepted to study there. And so as I went to the university, the local Baptist church where my elder sister had become a Christian used to send a church bus to pick up students so that we could go and attend church there. So that's how my elder sister told me where to get the bus, and I began to go to the local Baptist church. The Lord was very gracious to me in that a few months before I began attending this church, it had just received a new pastor, and he was the first indigenous Zambian pastor. Prior to that, there were a number of missionaries for approximately 20 years. So he was really the first man. And although he was indigenous, he had actually grown up in Scotland. So he was coming back home. He had gotten converted while he was studying in Scotland, and he was exposed to the big names in the 1970s in the UK, Lloyd Jones and others. And consequently, when he came, he had an expository form of ministry that was totally absent in the country. And I sat under his ministry for 5 years. About a year after my conversion, I was baptized, and by the same pastor. And I remember beginning to have this real thirst to become a pastor. And initially, I rebuked myself. I thought perhaps I'm just sort of admiring my pastor and wanting to imitate him. But the desire was not going away. I was involved in personal evangelism. I was involved in the Christian Union group on campus. But this preaching, it disturbed me why I should have such a desire. So finally, because this thing wasn't going away, I went to an older Christian in our hall of residence. We used to have a weekly Bible study. And so the guy who used to lead it, at least I could see that he had a mature way of handling the Bible. And so I went to him and told him what I was going through. Bear in mind, I was a Christian for just slightly over a year, so I was still a very young Christian. And so his counsel to me amounted, he brought me to Romans chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul seems to have known that God would have him to go to Rome, but he didn't know when. And so he was sort of getting himself ready. And his counsel to me was basically the same, that you can have a sense of what God wants you to do, but you may not know when to do it. So he asked me to be faithful, to pray to the Lord, to continue using my gifts and see how the Lord would lead. I had been hoping he would say to me, here are a few Bible college addresses, quit, you might get a scholarship there and go study the Bible. So I was a little disappointed that, he didn't do that. But I had a lot of respect for him. And in fact, when I was testifying like this in the church where he's an elder, he came to see me afterwards and said he doesn't remember that discussion at all. But that's what happens, isn't it? The counselor normally doesn't remember because you've got so many people that you've counseled. But the individual benefiting from your counsel is the one who remembers because it's epoch-making for him. And that's what it was for me. So for the next 7 years, I basically simply continued to be faithful, whatever door the Lord opened for me that I went through. I made one major mistake, and I keep correcting our own young people in the church about it. I was trying to be very spiritual. So when I went back after my meeting with this gentleman, I prayed thus to the Lord. I said, Lord, if it's you who's calling me, I want to test it. And the test is this: I will not tell anybody about it. And I want you to open the door. Now, I should not have included my pastor in the nobody about it. That's the mistake I made. I should have gone to my pastor and shared with him. But I didn't. So all the period that I was doing my studies at university and under this pastor, I kept that information away from him. However, I studied his preaching method. I used to sit, the first pew was like where this table is, and that's the pulpit, and I used to sit there as he was preaching, feverishly taking notes of his sermons. And so, in a sense, I could see the pattern and the way in which he was opening up the scriptures. In my last year at university, the gentleman who was leading the Christian student movement, evangelical movement in the country, asked me to give the opening address at the student conference, the annual student conference. And my pastor was one of the main two speakers. So I preached from Isaiah chapter 40, and my pastor came to me and said, "Could you preach this coming Sunday evening?" Now, in the 5 years I'd been there, I don't remember a single student being offered the pulpit. So it made me realize there's probably something he has seen in my preaching. So I agreed, sweated for the next few days, to try and come up with the most powerful sermon that one could ever come up with. And I finally preached that Sunday evening. Some of you have picked up this phrase about the African Persian thing, which makes me blush a lot. But it was that Sunday evening when I first heard that phrase and thought it would never happen again. As people were coming out of church, one gentleman, an elderly man, stood there, looked at me and said, "You know, I always thought Spurgeon was dead. I didn't know we had him in our congregation." Now, that was part of what grieved me that day, the praises I got. So I asked the pastor that I wanted to see him, and I went to visit him the following day. And I complained to him about people praising and so on. And he's a very wise man. He had his hand over his mouth as I was talking. So when I finished, he removed his hand. He was actually smiling. And then he said to me, this business of wanting to hide behind the cross is hyper spirituality. What you need to do is when people praise you, you take that praise to the one it ultimately belongs to. And it is to the Lord. And so on. And he said, it's just that after the service I was busy counseling other people. Otherwise, I had intended to come to tell you as well how I appreciated your sermon. So it was out of that conversation that I now shared with him what had been happening in my heart for the last 4 or so years. And because I thought I might never go to Bible college, I asked him to recommend a book in each of the disciplines that you study in Bible college, so that as I finished my mining engineering studies, I could take those books and study them. So he gave me a title in each, and as I went to work in the mines, I was now having my own personal study. I'd worked out a timetable for myself that I was studying in the evenings. Let me be quick on this last part. The town I went to to work in, my pastor resigned within a year. Part of it, I caused it, but not directly. I became the youth leader, and in the youth group, I would give them a Bible study 1 week, and then the following week, I would preach on the same text. So what happened was that the age range began to grow in the youth group. Before long, the elders began attending the youth group, and one day the pastor also came and sat in. Now, what I didn't know was that the youths were telling the elders that you come and listen to what preaching is supposed to be. And what I didn't know is that when the elders began to come, they then went to the pastor and said, you come and hear what preaching is supposed to be. And then they sent him on forced leave to try and improve his preaching. And they asked me to stand in while he was out. I tried to help him, and after his leave, when he came back, it was the worst sermon I'd ever heard in my life. I don't know what happened to him. So to cut the long story short, he resigned. And then the elders said to me, as long as you're not working on a Sunday, the pulpit is yours. If you're working, get us a preacher. So for the next 2 years, that's what was happening. And having a full-time job and preaching and following up individuals, I began to go through depressions. And one of my former elders came one day and found me in a depression. Upon inquiring from me what was going on, he said to me, you are destroying yourself. You are doing too much. You need to quit. I couldn't quit my job because I needed the money. I couldn't quit preaching and all that went around it because that was my life. So I wrote to my former pastor, and it was at that time that he then wrote to me and said, Kabwata Baptist Church, that I had been a part of in terms of establishing when I was at university, was looking for a pastor. And if I took up the pastorate there, he was willing to convince his church to pay my salary for the first 3 years. And of course, I didn't pray about it. I had been waiting for 7 years for the Lord to open the door. So I was grateful he gave them my name. They called me for interviews, and that's how I found myself as a pastor there. My first day of work was 1st September 1987. So beginning of last month, I began my 31st year in that congregation. They've been a wonderful family of God, more of enduring my shortcomings. I started at the age of 25 as a pastor without having gone to Bible college, made a lot of mistakes along the way. They've been very forgiving, and now we are a happy team together. So that's how the Lord has led us over the years.